truly, we have collected, as far as I heard last, like 0.5 petabyte of acoustic data over the last 5 years, which is 72 years of continuous listening. So obviously no human being can do that. So
Hey guys, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. I'm Matthew Kristoff. On this podcast, we talk about environmental sciences. Today's episode, it's all about biodiversity. So I brought on Tara Narwani. She is a science communicator with the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute. And as it says in the name, they monitor biodiversity. So they're an institute that's dedicated towards, biodiversity in all senses of the word. So from types of dust mites up to white-tailed deer and grizzly bears and plants and mosses and everything in between. So they're trying to capture all of the biodiversity, which is a huge, huge task to do. So it requires a lot of people, a lot of minds, and a lot of money. And they have been doing this since, I think she said, the late 90s. And it's a really cool organization. They don't just monitor biodiversity. They also are trying to create tools by which decision makers and policymakers can assess that information, that biodiversity, and try to inform decisions from that. So it's really, really neat. They have all kinds of neat tools on their website if you want to check them out. That's just abmi.ca. All kinds of ways to look at human footprint as it directly correlates to certain species and that kind of stuff. It's neat. We had a great conversation just talking about why it's important to measure biodiversity. Why is that a good metric for ecological resilience, that kind of stuff, and also the human footprint and the ABMI and how we can start to incorporate the information they've gathered into environmental management. Very, very neat. Check it out. It's awesome. I really enjoyed talking with Tara. She's a very knowledgeable, awesome person. I hope I can have her on again sometime. This podcast is brought to you by West Fraser. Their funds are made available through the Forest Resource Improvement Association of Alberta, and I couldn't thank them enough for their support this year. It has made this podcast possible. Also, with support from Greenlink Forestry and Damaged Timber. Damaged Timber is an apparel company out of Edmonton, and they are supporting environmental sciences through the sale of their clothing. Check them out, damagedtimber.com. 10% of everything they sell goes towards an environmental sciences scholarship for environmental sciences students. So check them out. You can support environmental sciences just through buying clothes, and they got cool stuff. They got hats, toques, t-shirts, sweaters, all kinds of stuff. It's awesome. Check them out. Your Forest 10 at checkout to get 10% off of that. So without any further messing around, let's get into it. Talk about biodiversity with Tara. She's awesome. You guys are going to like her. And here we go. How did you get involved with ABMI? Like, what's your background?
Yeah, it's a funny thing, actually. I've been a scientist most of my life. So I trained initially, my undergrad is in biology and math. And then I did a master's degree in ecophysiology, focused on
ecophysiology.
I
don't know. I think I know what that is. I'll think about it long enough. But
basically, we look at physiological traits of organisms and how that makes them suitable for their particular ecology.
Okay, cool.
And so I was really interested in how the photosynthesis of plants, plants photosynthesize differently and have different anatomical structures to live in different parts of a forest, for example, whether in sunlight or in shady patches or whatever it might be. So I did a master's degree in ecophysiology, and then I came to Edmonton to do a PhD in molecular biology. But I was really interested in science communication. So even after my master's degree, I started doing some studies I did a course at Ryerson University in Toronto. That's where I came from. So I came from Toronto. That's where I did my studies. After my master's degree, I did a little bit of journalism work.
Oh, nice.
And when I was doing my PhD, I actually did a little bit of writing for the Gateway magazine, which is a U of A student newspaper.
Yeah.
And then for View Weekly, which I just heard went under, unfortunately, in this new media environment. Yeah, it's tough.
No kidding.
And then, so I was just really interested. And then I did a media fellowship with CBC Radio during my PhD.
Nice.
Doing medical and science reporting. And then as I gave birth to my daughter and was trying to write out my PhD, I saw this. This is amazing. Like, this is an email, I feel like, that changed my life. I saw an email from the Canadian Science Writers Association that said, job posting, science writer, science communicator in Edmonton. I'm like, hey, I'm in Edmonton. I'm a science communicator.
Yeah.
I got to apply for this thing. And the funny part of it is that I applied for the job and I literally moved. I got the job and I moved 5 floors. So I was studying 5 floors higher in this building where we are now, in the Centennial Center for Interdisciplinary Science at the U of A. And I came down to the first floor.
That's awesome.
But I didn't know that the ABMI existed. I was sort of in a totally different world. And
university is a big place. It's easy to get lost in the complexity of it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, I like to say I'm a scientist by training, but a science communicator by heart. And so that's really what drew me to the ABMI, was figuring out how to communicate all of the science and different kinds of knowledge that's being generated by this institute. That's
cool. Yeah, as I go through this podcast, I realized that a background in journalism would have been wise. Not that I was planning on ever doing this, but like, yeah, that's one that I'm starting to appreciate more and more, of the complexities of what is journalism and how to build a story and that kind of stuff. Because like, yeah, I'm just flying by the seat of my pants.
Yeah, I mean, they definitely think that there are tricks of the trade. Like, they'll tell you about like the hook at the beginning of any story and how that's important to capture a reader's attention, right? Mm-hmm. But I also think there's just a lot about like the tools, and that's changed. That changes so rapidly these days.
Oh yeah, no kidding.
And the media landscape and what the different who the different parties are, and that's changing so rapidly these days. And the types of stories people want to hear has also changed. I think the other thing about journalism school, which I think I would have gotten a lot out of too, is just the ethics of it. Thinking about what does it mean to tell a factually based story, and how to make sure that you tell the facts true to the facts, but also in a riveting way that captures people's attention.
That's a part that I don't put a lot of attention into fact checking these episodes, because I bring on professionals, so I assume that like the professional is going to know what the professional is talking about, and I've been caught saying some stupid shit before, so it's I'm starting to recognize like, maybe I should look into that, but it's something I do in my spare time, so it's kind of it's not a full-time gig.
Yeah, for sure, it totally makes sense. Plus, you're right. I mean, most of the I'm sure most of the professionals do know, and you're asking for their their thoughts and their viewpoints, right? So it's not like you're saying, let's factually look at, I don't know, like the predator-prey, dynamics or something like that, right?
No, yeah, it's just more of a conversation for sure.
Right.
So getting into what like ABMI is all about. So Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute.
Yes.
Right? Okay.
Yes, it is a mouthful.
It makes sense. Though. It tells the whole name. Yeah, everything's there, right?
Right.
So I wanted to start with, what is important about measuring biodiversity? Like, we always hear biodiversity all the time, especially like environmental writing and that kind of stuff, right? It's important, but you don't hear a lot about why, right?
Right.
So let's just start with that. Why is biodiversity important?
Yeah, I think that's one of those tough questions. Actually, It's a tough question for us.
Funny how the easy ones are, like the simple ones seem to be the harder ones, because they're philosophical almost. It's weird.
I do think there's a philosophical thing, and actually, it's funny that you ask this question, because sometimes I go into classrooms and sometimes talk about biodiversity, and something I'll ask kids is, does anyone know anything about plants, for example? And, a lot of kids will kind of roll their eyes and like, plants seem kind of boring, right? And I said, okay, so what do plants give you? And, eventually they'll kind of say, well, they might get to fruit or vegetables. But depending on their age, you'll finally get them to say, well, probably things like, wood products and paper products, and then eventually you can get them to say something like oxygen. Right. I'm like, oh, that's pretty important, would you not say, for all of us human beings?
Yeah.
So, anyways, the importance of biodiversity, it's hard, because I think most people, and I include myself in this, I really do feel like we take the natural systems around us and how they support our life and our lifestyles for granted. So ultimately, biodiversity, I mean, one of the ways in which to look at it is biodiversity does supply ecosystem services. The biodiversity around us is part of a processes that then supply human beings with nature's services. That's what we call it.
Okay.
So things like water purification, or the production of wood, or the production of fodder or food, production of materials. But other things even that are a bit more abstract, like recreational value. They give us those places and spaces that make us feel part of the world we live in, or give us solace or opportunity for recreation, enjoyment.
For sure.
They can be inspiration. So I think there's like biodiversity is important because it really supports our lives in very fundamental ways. And then it also gives us opportunities to, you know, be human in the world.
Yeah.
And so I think the problem with biodiversity is it's hard to sort of say, how does each piece in the biodiversity puzzle, if you will, fit into supplying us with these services, or how do they each contribute to those things that we benefit from?
Yeah. And that's kind of what I'm getting at, I guess, when I say biodiversity, right? Because biodiversity, you know, taking to mean there's a lot of different things in an area or whatever, right? But how does one measure what that, like, what does that mean really? Like, how much biodiversity is a good amount of biodiversity? How much is too little, too much? Is there, like, you know what I mean? It's a very ethereal kind of idea, biodiversity.
Yeah.
Right? So how do you go about measuring something like that and determining whether or not that is a healthily biodiverse spot?
Right. No, it's a really good question. And you know what? The truth of the matter, this is where the philosophical, or let's say the societal values come in too, right? Because there are certain situations where you can say, okay, well, if we remove this particular species from a system, then you can start to see some effects, right? So if you remove a top predator from a system, then you can start to see how the other species in that food chain might predominate in terms of their numbers go up and change the dynamics of the whole system. Yeah. And so you could argue, well, that system is now in a new state that is, you know, could be considered unsustainable because it's causing problems from the point of view of human beings and how we interact with that system, or it's pushing out other species. And so, you know, it's creating dynamics that we don't necessarily want or understand fully. Yeah. But it all comes down to the ABMI provides information on the state or the condition of the environment. Okay. People then take those numbers or take those metrics or take the state of those indicators. And then, you know, and the government of Alberta or the federal government using similar kinds of data, they're making decisions on, you know, what's good or bad. Is there a threshold at which we've sort of passed some threshold that we don't want to pass? And that could be from the perspective of that threshold, once we pass it, does start to create problems for like fish stocks or create problems for managing soil or for, you know, it creates conditions where you might have algal blooms in lakes and things like that. Right. So we ourselves don't set those thresholds that are important. For sure. Those are governmental decisions, and those typically, I think the government would say, don't want to speak for them, but they're trying to set thresholds that reflect multiple interests, like economic interests, social interests, and the sort of biological or the ecological, you know, condition that's important to meet. Okay. So it's a tough one to say because I don't think there's not one set answer. You know, sure. It could be in a particular location. We know that there's this sort of tipping point that if you add this much phosphorus into the system, you start to have eutrophication, and so you might try to set guidelines or manage the land in such a way and the land base in such a way so you don't have phosphorus runoff or phosphate runoff into the aquatic system. Okay. And you limit that kind of thing. But to go to like a provincial level, like the ABMI operates at a provincial level, we do monitoring from border to border. Those questions are really the important questions people are asking themselves, like how much development is okay in the northern part of the province? How much development is okay in the southern part of the province? It's not the question we ask ourselves. We just sort of say, okay, this is the condition. This is how, this is the trend in those conditions. Here are some of the species that seem to be more vulnerable to certain kinds of activities, and really trying to parse out those kinds of patterns and trends. For sure. So
it's kind of like, it's almost like biodiversity as a metric for ecosystem health or ecosystem resilience, I guess. Does that make sense? Does that kind of sound right?
Yeah. And in fact, and this is where, to talk about that, I mean, a lot of traditionally people who often do monitoring, and this is not a bad thing, but often there's been, you know, like an interest in a particular charismatic species, right? Sure. So
grizzly bears, caribou,
exactly, or
bull trout,
right, or the ferruginous hawk, or you know, those kinds of things. And don't get me wrong, those are like iconic species. People can see them. They're often associated with the stories we tell ourselves about, how we interact with the land and the things that inspire us. And so a lot of time monitoring can often be about the specific species in a specific area and a specific time frame, trying to understand what's causing changes that are being observed, and then seeing if there are ways in which we can, reduce the trend towards extirpation or elimination of a particular species in a certain area.
Yeah.
And so those types of activities have been really important, and they're important in terms of helping us. That's why we still have, the bald eagle in the U.S.
Right.
Is it the bald eagle? Anyways.
I'm not sure.
There's a bunch of...
it's their symbol, so I'm guessing it's still there.
Yeah. There's a bunch of EPA legislation around protecting these kinds of species, right? And they've been, for the most part, it seems like they've often been quite successful.
Oh, like the burrowing owl and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. But in Alberta, there was a different... I'm trying to go back to sort of what was the reason why the ABMI was established.
Sure.
And there really was at some point, I think it was really in the late 90s, there was a lot of, new activity around oil sands development. Forestry was certainly a large industry in the province. There's agriculture. There's a lot of natural resource extraction and use. And so there was also a lot of legislation about legislation or policy around how should we manage our biodiversity in this province. But there wasn't really a body at that time that was sort of saying, how do we collect this information in a sort of value neutral way so we can all make decisions about, okay, these are the activities and these are the way that it's having effect on the plants and animals in the province.
Right.
And so there were a group of people, actually, I think as far as the history books go, it was largely foresters and academics who came together and said, we need a system in this province that doesn't necessarily look at one particular species or a few species, because we kind of have a handle on that.
Yeah.
We sort of understand that story, but we really want to understand more effectively when you look at the cumulative impact of all of these activities across common species and common habitats and landscapes in this province. What is the effect? And can we start to use that kind of information? If we collect that information, can we use that information to make different decisions or to guide our decision making, let's say, on how do we sort of find ways to more effectively use our land base while still having a working landscape? Or how do we make sure that we identify those species that are particularly vulnerable before they become at risk or of concern, and then start to figure out how to make decisions to manage that? So the ABMI's program is pretty different because it's not about one specific species at risk or even a number of them. And there are groups that certainly do that work, and it's very important work. It's complementary work.
Of course.
But we look at common species. So when we're in the boreal forest and we're monitoring plants and animals, we're literally looking at all the plants at the locations that we survey.
Right.
We're looking at lichen species, at all the lichen that are there, all the moss, all the bird species, all the mammal species. And we even look at aquatic invertebrates in the wetlands. And we look at some soil invertebrates as well. So we're not targeting one species. We want to. Sorry, I'll back up and say we want to understand how the general biodiversity is responding to human activity.
That's the cool part, right? Is that I had the conversation with Todd Zimmerling from the Alberta Conservation Association. We were talking about conservation and what is conservation? How do we define it? Because there is a lot of those organizations around the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, or there's the Wolf Foundation. There's a bunch of different organizations that are dedicated to a species, right? And you're that's awesome. We need that. We need that to, to keep an eye on them, and they probably need a lot of help. And caribou, same thing, right? They need a lot of assistance, and we need to do that. We need to monitor them. But what about the ones that are creeping up that we don't know about, right? The dust mite or some kind of insect, or the moss that we don't know about that it's not very charismatic. And so I think that's the cool part that happens here, is the bringing all of that together to try and catch it before it's a problem, right? That's pretty cool. I like that. Yeah,
and I think the other thing that I tell people about the ABMI, our name is Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute, as you said, and so people get that there's the biodiversity piece, and so I imagine, because this is what I imagined when I first heard about it, that, we have a lot of folks who go out in the field and collect, samples, and we do that.
Yep.
But we also collect a whole bunch of Earth observation data so we want to understand not just what critters are where they are and what number,
Mhm.
but we also want to understand the state of the landscape in those positions. And so we also collect, we have a bunch of satellite data that we interpret for human footprint. So we understand on a year by year basis, how much more roads do we have? How many more roads do we have? How much more, how many more how many more parcels of land may have been converted in different ways? And now we're even getting to the point where we really are starting to look more deeply into how are those lands that have been converted, and we call them human footprint. How are they recovering? So how can we sort of discount some of that human footprint from the overall inventory as they recover? How do we, how much more harvest blocks do we have? What ages are they, and what are their trajectories of recovery? So we have a bunch of Earth observation, but we also then interpret photo plot information to get really detailed land cover information. And the goal of the program is really to understand what's driving changes in biodiversity from the perspective of what is the land transformation that's occurring. And that's the key driver, really, of changes in biodiversity.
So it's our impact on the land, and you're measuring how that's connected.
Okay.
Gotcha.
So we have to have both the left hand and the right hand to understand these changes, and that's the critters, where they are, and then also what are the changes on the landscape? How is the land being converted in different ways? And so we take those two pieces of information, and ultimately what the ABMI produces, I think, is something we call the species habitat models. So it's really understanding, which habitats in the province are like the favored habitat of a particular species. So where would you predict to find those species? And then also we can, based on those predictions, we can then start to say, well, if you convert this habitat to something else, you're actually you have less habitat then for that particular species, and you're driving the numbers. That's a driver for changing the numbers of that species down.
Of course.
But there are other species that are, generalists that can take advantage of human modified landscapes. And then those species numbers, abundances are predicted to go up. So like coyotes or dandelions, and people are familiar with these generalist species. So we create these species habitat models, and so we can look at the province and go, where are you likely to find the black-throated green warbler or things like that? And then how would so then we can start to actually even do some predictions if we modify the landscape in this way, where the black-throated green warbler is predicted to be, we're likely going to change its abundance in that area, and we can start to make decisions based on whether we want that or not.
For sure. Would you consider like white-tailed deer to be one of those species that's, it takes off with human impact? It seems to me like from my perspective, it seems like it definitely does. Like we're seeing that impact on like caribou herds and all that kind of stuff, right? So is that one that's considered to be like hand in hand with people kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I believe that, and see, this is where
this is more specific. I know.
Yeah,
I'm not
this
trying
is where,
to.
No, it's okay. This is where my biology, I'm like, oh, I'm not a field biologist. But as far as I remember, there's actually, you can look up ABMI. Here, I'll put it this way.
Yeah.
The good thing about it is you can look at our data and analytics portal, and you can look up deer on the biodiversity browser, and you can actually see where the deer have been found, and you can look at those species habitat relations, and then you can actually look at what we call their response, their sector effects, their response to different sectors.
That's cool.
So you can see whether or not they're predicted to go up or predicted to go down.
I'm totally doing that
response.
as soon as I leave here.
Yeah, as I was going to say, I can do it right now, but since I'm not facing the computer, and I'll show you that.
Yeah. Well, it's the reason I ask is because it was a question I posed a couple episodes ago regarding, I thought that there was a concern regarding the expansion of white-tailed deer into places where they were not historically, as far as I know, right?
Yeah.
I was wondering what our response should be to that, and if we can have an effect or whatever. But that's a different question. We don't need to talk about that. But that's why I asked. That's cool to have that. Yeah, do you actually have that?
Well, I mean, the cool thing is, because of the fact that we monitor biodiversity across the province in different locations, and what we can do with that, and we collect a lot of information about different species at each of those sites.
Yeah.
We actually have about over 1,000 what we call complete species profiles on our website. You can go there and see where we've detected those species. You can see those models that we call the Species Habitat Association. So you can see where the deer, white-tailed deer prefer, which habitats they prefer.
Yeah.
And then you can look at something that we call sector effects. So this is how the species will respond to different types of industrial activity. And the sector effects for the forested region of the province, as shown on the biodiversity browser, indicate to us that deer in general, they'll take advantage of agricultural areas and transportation areas and energy footprint. So yeah, you're seeing in those types of footprint
those linear
types,
disturbances in the bush and stuff. Yeah,
you will start to see. We would predict that the abundance of deer in general are increasing. So this data is based on winter tracking data, so we can't actually distinguish the different deer types.
Oh, okay.
But now we've moved. So this is historical data. We've now moved to camera tracking, and so we will have new deer very soon to report that will now start to parse out the different deer species based on our ability to visualize them. Yeah. So in general, the biodiversity browser right now does show that deer in general, mule deer and white-tailed deer, will in fact respond to these types of their increaser species, we call them. So they take advantage of these human transformed landscapes.
Yeah. And then imagine there's going to be somewhere in that model, there's going to be an equal and opposite reaction from some other species, probably, right?
Yeah.
That tends to be the way this kind of, it's a balance act, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I wouldn't call it a zero-sum game, but there are definitely species that, for sure, there are species that we see. It's not just that species are declining in human transformed landscapes. There are definitely species that take advantage of it, and there are species that are particularly vulnerable to the loss of certain kinds of habitat, and those species will definitely be seen to decrease when they lose their habitats in certain environments.
Yeah, for sure.
So, yeah, I mean, what's amazing to me is I wasn't fully aware of myself before I started working at the ABMI that there were as many increaser species, so those species that can take advantage of new habitat types.
Right.
But also that there are some species that are very, very, have a great deal of specificity, and they need certain habitat types, and changes in the landscape that don't affect those habitat types don't really have an impact on them.
Yeah. So generally speaking, would you say that we're heading towards a situation with, like, where we're getting more and more impact, I'm assuming, right?
Yes.
So we're heading towards a situation where there's more and more concern for those species that are more delicate, right? Where we need to be paying more, like there's more and more need for an organization like this to be paying attention to that stuff and seeing it coming, right?
Yeah, so in Alberta, we definitely see there's been a trend. So we've been measuring trend in human footprint, or trend in the degree to which human beings are transforming the landscape. We've been monitoring that since 1999, and that's increasing year over year. And in general, the scientific literature, so this is just a consensus worldwide, that really the largest driver is now starting to compete with climate change. But the largest driver of change in abundance and species is land transformation, or the creation of human footprint. Okay. So there's no doubt, as you convert land on the landscape, you're going to have impacts.
Just to be clear, the converting, like, that includes like any kind of anthropogenic impact, right? Like, you're talking about a temporary road, or like a lease that's not a lease anymore. Like, that's still considered a footprint until it gets, I'm guessing there's a threshold at which it's decided that, okay, that's part of the ecosystem again, and not. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll be a little bit more clear about the definition. So at the ABMI, we define human footprint to be anything that we can see visibly from the air. And so we don't include right now things like pollution, noise pollution, or chemical pollution.
Oh, okay.
Or let's say recreational impact or activity. So if there's lots of people, off-roading, and we can't visibly see trails, so that's difficult for us to measure. Although we're looking for ways to start to measure some of those other kinds of human activities on the landscape. But if it's a visible transformation, so like low impact seismic lines, other linear features, we definitely have roads of a variety of different kinds and surfaces and sizes. All of those features are considered to be footprint. And the way the ABMI has traditionally handled footprint is, we say once a footprint, always a footprint. Because of the fact that we don't want to be the deciders. We haven't wanted to traditionally be able to decide when something is no longer a footprint. So, however, having said that, there is definitely, we're doing a lot more research now and saying, okay, there might be a reason to want to know that this particular harvest block was established in, 1940 or 1960 or something like that. Sure. Because it might actually help us understand really fully over long time horizons what the recovery of different habitat types are.
That's cool.
So we maintain those records and sort of say this is the total footprint, but now we're starting to do for different reasons, looking at how do we discount that properly based on the science to say, okay, yeah, these harvest blocks, you don't actually see them from the air now. Now, today, we no longer see them. We did see them at one point. Yeah. So how do we, in a sense, discount the footprint, accumulation of footprint to account for this kind of recovery?
That's a cool part. That's the part that I'm interested in, because there's a place at which, like, we'll take a harvest block, for example, because that's like, I mean, it's probably one of the most low impact regarding like soil compression and that kind of stuff, right?
Right.
So it has the most capacity to get back to quote unquote natural or whatever, right? So yeah, that one's interesting to me. It'd be interesting to see where that threshold lies regarding biodiversity of when it goes from, say, a cut block, comparing that to the same age of a burn or something like that, and how those compare as far as biodiversity. If there's going to be a difference, because like, one's a burn and one's just removing the biggest stuff, one's removing the smallest stuff, so there's going to be a difference. But I'd be curious to see what that difference is, because I mean, when you get the regen coming back, that regeneration is going to be more or less the same, right? Maybe less dense or more dense, but it's going to be, so that's a cool one. I'd be really interested to know the answer to that question.
Yeah, in fact, we did, and I can share this with you. We did do a study with ALPAC, looking at what we call the recovery of intactness. So we were looking at sort of basically the complement of species that we expect to be in a given area. How long does it take to where does the intactness of a harvest block converge to the same point post fire or post harvest?
Yeah.
And actually, I don't recall the details just now, but there were some really interesting things, that some things recovered more quickly than you would expect,
for sure, in
the harvest block than in the fire. Other things were about on the same rate of regeneration. But I
would imagine that like aspen stands are probably going to come back more or less the same, because we're not planting those, whereas the planted conifer stands, I'm guessing, are probably going to come back faster than something in the natural environment. But yeah, I get it, and that could be positive or negative. Just because the trees are growing doesn't mean that's the way it's supposed to be. So that's the interesting part that I'm
so about. Again, I mean, the details, and so this is where I have to just say my role at the ABMI. So as the director of the information center, my role is really about how do we manage our data and communicate the data, report on the data, make the data publicly available to users of the data. So I don't always have all the details of the science at my fingertips. However,
I'm not supposed to know everything. It's okay.
It's all good. But I would say that this has been a really interesting piece of work. So people are really interested in saying, well, is that are these trajectories of recovery post fire, post harvest block, the same in different habitat types? So there's more and more interest in looking at that type of thing, and then being able to, for us to be able to say, okay, once you reach this threshold of whatever it may be, this is when we can reasonably discount that footprint from the inventory.
Yeah.
And so we would report kind of two metrics then. We would sort of report total footprint. So what was in fact created on the landscape at some point.
You want to keep that. You want to know what we did, for sure.
Yeah. And then also something which we're calling, I'm trying to remember the exact metric, but basically that reflects that recovery component. And the other thing is the reason why we maintain both of those data sets would be because there are people who have different questions. So we don't know, like, again, is there a data user who's really interested in knowing all the footprint that it has ever been, imposed on the Alberta's landscape, versus those who just want to know subsequent to a certain date, or that have a certain kind of recovery trajectory.
For sure.
So we just try not to make that decision a priori for data users. Smart. And just try to maintain that data so that we can support whatever people's end question might be.
So is that all that's all available?
So right now, what's available on the website is what we call the human footprint inventory. So that's the wall-to-wall human footprint inventory for multiple years. I think we've got 2000, 2010, 12, 14, 15, 16, 17.
Okay.
We will be including the recovery piece into that soon. It's work that's ongoing, so it has not yet been included.
Gotcha.
But some of our new reporting products that will be coming out in 2020 will have that new recovery component included in it.
Oh, that's cool. Because I imagine that there'll be a lot of interest on that's I'm a forester, so that's where my brain is going. And a hunter, which is why I asked about deer.
I
got my own biases.
All good. Yeah.
But I was thinking about, as you're talking about the biodiversity and the recovery and that kind of stuff, I think there would be a lot of interest in the forestry sector regarding, and that's probably why ALPAC was involved with that, regarding, because that could drastically change the way we do things, right? Like if you find out that, okay, the biodiversity is slightly different at this age, age class compared to a fire or some other natural event that we can compare to, and how can we change that back so it does become more, it might be very simple things that we have to do that, right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
I don't know. So that's the cool part, is that I think, they're going to be different, but how do we figure out how they're different, why they're different, and then we can start to sort that out and become better at harvesting timber, right? And that kind of stuff. That's the part that excites me, is the part of supporting a sustainable resource like that, but constantly not settling for good enough, making sure that we're pushing that and, like, doing it right for all values, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's the cool part. I like that a lot.
Yeah, so I think having that kind of information just makes everybody, gives them a lot more tools in their toolkit.
Yeah.
And similarly, the ABMI was a collaborator on a project called the Ecological Recovery Monitoring Project, where we were looking at the trajectories of recovery of well sites. And so well sites of different age classes were treated very differently. So they were either, like, in other words, the full soil was removed and there was a lot of compaction. And then subsequently there was probably not a lot of return of those resources. Whereas I believe well site recovery methodology has changed significantly over the last couple of decades. Anyways, to really understand how the ecological recovery of those sites is very markedly different based on the way in which they were treated, then gives us more ammunition, if you will, to sort of say, well, this is a better way of recovering sites. There still may be ways in which we introduce certain agents that help us meet the recovery goals that we might have.
Totally.
So again, how do we look at, well, there's a lot of certified well sites, certified, I guess, closed well sites, really. Did I say websites?
Websites, yeah.
I think
well
I did
sites.
say well sites.
We're getting
certified reclaimed well sites. It is a land liability for Albertans. So really understanding how do those sites recover, and other ways in which we can encourage that recovery.
Yeah.
And just to be able to say we understand that recovery. In the very least, we understand what the recovery looks like, as opposed to just sort of saying, okay, they're on some recovery trajectory, but we don't really know what it looks like.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think that's important to do, because a lot of in the past, a lot of the reaction to recovery for those kind of places was just like, leave it, it'll grow back, right? Which is like, we didn't understand compaction and all kinds of stuff. So no, for sure, I think there's a huge need for that. It's interesting to see the complexity of which, like, I can't imagine trying to wrap your head around, like, the entire complexity that is this problem, right, of biodiversity as a ecosystem monitoring tool for, like, ecosystem health and how you measure that, right? That's the cool part. I like that.
Yeah, well, so the ABMI traditionally has had what we're calling now our ecosystem health program.
Sure.
So the way the ABMI first started, and I'll just dial back to those early days where it was like really a bunch of folks in resource industries and academics and governmental people who were saying, hey, we really do need a program that arm's length measures this condition of the environment so that everyone, in a sense, has the right information around whether or not they're meeting their policy obligations, right?
Yeah.
And
that's
so
the thing, right? Like, if you're sorry, I totally cut you off there, but I just had a thought that I forgot about. When I mentioned it was regarding that, like you just said, the increase in information for those values, right? And if I think it's important to point out that if you're somebody that find yourself emotionally attached to the old way of doing things or something like that, right? Like you don't believe in these new values or something, then maybe you have to step back and question yourself. Why are you becoming emotional? Because there's a lot of that, I think, that happens in the world, right? Everyone, and recognizing that we need to make sure that all of this is sustainable for all values, period. Otherwise it's not sustainable. That's literally that, like, you know what I mean? Like, it's so that's the cool part, I think, that we have to ensure that we continue to increase the number of values we're including in this management scheme, right? So the biodiversity one's a fascinating one for that, because it's a new, I think, with ABMI, it's a new kind of way of looking at the forest that I think we haven't done in the past, where we went from just straight up, looking at tree cover, like, yeah, that should be enough to look at biodiversity or to a healthy landscape, right? But it's gone so much more deeper than that, and that's the cool part. So when it comes to, like, the data part of it, right? So getting that data out so that it is useful to stakeholders and managers and that kind of stuff. how do you go about creating something that is, I guess, that is used, right? That it, 'cause, I mean, I think there's a lot of organizations out there that'll create a tool like, hey, we have this tool, it does this, this, and that, and it's kind of overwhelming for people, and they don't want to learn it, and it's you know what I mean? So it ends up sitting on the shelf and not getting used. How do you go about creating something that's like user friendly, that's going to be used, that you know has the right values in it, the right things that that the stakeholders are going to want?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the tricky part.
Yeah.
So, I mean, my whole history in science has been about, my whole career in science is really about, everyone's doing great research, and they're producing interesting papers. And certainly the people who are in the fields, they take advantage of those papers and they build their own academic careers or their own academic activities around those things, right? But if you're trying to make sure that that information gets pushed out so it's informing policy or helping people make operational decisions, that's a tricky thing. And many scientists, that's not what they're there to do, right? That's not their mandate. That's not their business. Although I must say that there's definitely a lot more push for the scientific community to figure out how to communicate the results of their work more broadly. So I would just say in the early days of the ABMI, I think there was, there really was, first of all, there was a focus on let's build a program.
Yeah.
Let's figure out what the right protocols are. Let's figure out what the monitoring sampling design should look like. Let's build the infrastructure for doing this on an annual basis, using the same protocols, ensuring quality, and doing all of those kinds of things. That there was perhaps less focus on how do we get the data out once we have it. And so there was a point where, and I wasn't really around at this time, but certainly when I arrived at the ABMI, there was this sense, okay, we built this infrastructure, we have all this cool data, we want people to use it. Why aren't people using it as much as we thought they would? So we built it, but they didn't come, kind of thing, right? Yeah. So then the idea is, okay, well, what do we need to do to fundamentally change that? Because Albertans have invested in this program, and they want to see, ideally, I'm sure, that the information that's been gathered be used most effectively.
Totally.
And so it's like a multi-pronged approach. So initially, we sort of asked ourselves the question, okay, right now we're sharing what we call kind of raw data, and we have some interpretation of that data around what it means for how the species are behaving in the province.
Sure.
Certain species. But really, we also started doing a lot of these individual projects, which were, creating new data sets that people were interested in. And you can find that in one place on the website, and you can find the raw data in a different place, and you can find some of that summarized information in a third place. So the biggest problem initially was we just need to give a place where people understand they can go to one place. It's like a one-stop shop for the data that we have, they're looking for. And it's also available in multiple formats, because not everybody wants the raw data because they don't have the team of people in-house that can deal with that data or understand it or do manipulations of it.
Of course, yeah.
And there are people who just want to have that quick lookup, like that encyclopedia of Alberta species, and sort of be able to say, I want to know if this
Google
species
search,
exactly.
Well, the Wikipedia of biodiversity,
Exactly. So that's what we were trying to create here, and sort of say, so people go, okay, do they like this? Does this species, this bird like this habitat?
Right.
Do we need to pay attention? If the species is here, that type of thing. So understanding that there's always a spectrum of different data users, and how do you provide services, essentially products and services that meet the needs of that wide spectrum of users. So when we initially built what's our current data and analytics portal, we actually went and did a bunch of interviews, and we did a survey as well, a web survey, sort of an online survey, asking people, what is your day-to-day operational needs for data? How do you use it? What format do you need it? What are some of those pinch points or friction points for you?
Yeah.
You can't find the data that you're looking for, or it's not in the right format. What are some of your priorities in terms of the types of work you're doing? Like, is it more important for you to have detailed human footprint information, or is it more important for you to have specific species information?
Yep.
How would you prioritize those things? So based on that information, we really tried to say, okay, at our first kick at the can of trying to produce a more user-friendly portal for our data was really looking at those provincial land use decision makers and sort of saying what kind of data they need and in what format, and delivering that. So then we're now well deep into our next phase of thinking about this question. And the next phase has really been driven again by what we call we did a bunch of user needs assessments.
Yeah.
So this was much more detailed and it was cross-sectoral.
Sure.
So we basically said, okay, look, here's our mapping portal. This is where you can go and you can actually load ABMI wall-to-wall Alberta-wide maps on species distribution predictions or human footprint information.
I was looking at that earlier. That's pretty neat.
Yeah,
That's
and
cool.
you can get some summary information for different areas of interest.
Yeah.
And so we would present that to at these user needs workshops and sort of say, is this working for you? What would you prefer to see?
Yeah.
What are the additional functions you need? And we actually gathered a lot of really great feedback. And what people are really looking for now, and I think this is our expectation generally on the web nowadays, is that they want much more of a custom experience. There's still a sense that there's so much data we have to offer, but what can I do with it? I don't know how it will really fit into my workflow, or I don't know how to take all of these different pieces of information and still have them add up to a decision at the end of the day that might support my regulatory requirement. Yeah. Not that you can't do it. And I think their tools are there. Yeah. But when people have busy lives and they're using, they have their own tools that they're using. They don't necessarily, there's not necessarily a lot of time and flexibility to sort of go and look at how do I use this new information that's available. Yeah. So people have said things like, well, we want to look at as many layers as we want to at once. And we want to be able to define our own area of interest. And we want to be able to upload our own custom data layers to superimpose them just within the mapping portal itself. So really giving us that pointed feedback and saying, this is what the tool would make, this is what we would need to see in this tool to make it easier. And so from my perspective, I think this is just an ongoing opportunity. It's an ongoing, as technology changes, as the kind of data that we collect changes, as the types of things that people need to do with that data change, we just have to continue to evolve our tools. For sure. And it is a lot more about providing that custom experience. And the other thing is most people nowadays, they also want you to be able to deliver very large data sets to them rapidly in real time on the web, which, until fairly recently, was just not even possible. So there are new technologies that now allow us to, for example, to date, you can't look at our human footprint inventory feature map, which actually shows you all the roads and all of this and that. You can see what we call a heat map, which gives you sort of intensity of human footprint per kilometer squared pixel in the province. But the actual detailed human footprint inventory was just way too big. We couldn't call a server and have it load in any real time, right?
No kidding. That's what I was going to ask. Because if you want multiple layers up all the time, I don't know if anyone's ever tried to load ArcMap and load stuff on there. There's a point at which it just goes, nope, and shuts down. Yeah. Right? So that's being online, and it's dependent on how fast the internet is and all that kind of stuff. there's a lot of limitations there.
Right. And so what we've discovered is we have to go to a whole different new technology framework to be able to deliver this. So we're using something called vector tiles now that actually allows us to load pretty much in real time the human footprint inventory with the feature information fast. Yeah. Sort of like Google Maps. It's kind of like a Google Maps experience, but it's based on something called a vector tile technology. And so we'll be releasing that sometime probably late September or early October. You see a brand new version of the mapping portal that has all of our layers now. Sweet. That will allow you to load as many as you want, to be able to manipulate them how you want. Right. And then hopefully within the next few months, you'll start to be able to add your own shape files to it in your own data layers as well.
Nice. That's very cool. Yeah. That's very cool. Even in my job, what I do, that would be very beneficial for a lot of reasons, right? But it's like you said, people have to know about it, and it has to be user friendly, and the data management part of it has to flow, right? It can't be chunky.
It can't break, or it can't be it can't be it's there some days and some days it's not. People just will walk away from it
for sure.
So even if you build those tools, so it's the same thing. Even if you have the data and you build the tools, people still might not come. So the key thing is then you really have to, because people just aren't aware, right? No fault of anyone's. There's just so much out there. Totally. So this is where we also have, we write blogs, we write e-newsletters, we have a strong social media presence. But now we're also doing webinars where we're presenting these tools and walking people through them, how to use them, creating those online tutorials, and doing a lot more lunch and learns and going out and doing that actual outreach and engagement. So if somebody says to us, we have a particular, we're interested in understanding the trend and footprint for our watershed. Yep. We really are now reaching out to those kinds of groups and saying, here's the data that we have. This is how we think you can use it. And then being responsive to whatever interests they have or input that they're providing.
So are you guys going to regulatory meetings, like to the energy regulatory meetings, and to the forest colleges meetings and that kind of stuff? Because that's where the people want to learn that stuff, right? So,
So I think we interact in a variety of different ways with, I think I call it the regulatory process is for example, we work closely with, or we have ties to the planning branch at the government of Alberta.
For sure.
Or we know people within the Alberta Energy Regulator, and we're trying to say, here's a new tool or here's some more information. We know that it's being used too. But I think the key thing there is we are looking for opportunities to sort of say, is this data information useful for our regulatory processes? And if so, how can we actually embed them in there? So people, if they're required to submit a management plan, or they're required to submit an application for approval, are there actual things, that data layers that they should be required to use that will help the decision making process?
Of course there is. Totally. Absolutely.
And so I think we would benefit from stronger ties to those processes, mostly because the data is there.
Yeah, totally.
Right?
That's what I mean. It'd be cool to see you guys do presentations at I think about the College of Alberta Professional Foresters, our regulatory body, right? That's the type of stuff that we love to see. And if you went there and you said, hey, this is what we have, here's where you can contact us and tell us what you want, and you would get a lot of engagement, right? And I don't know if you guys are doing that or not, but it's that's the type of stuff I think telling the everyday industry person, right? In both the energy sector and in the forest sector and agriculture sector, all that, they're the ones who are going to know what they would like to see, what would help them be better, right? And that's the type of stuff that those are the people that need to know, I would think, right? So it's hard to get to everybody, right? How do you?
No. I think it's a great idea. So I think I'm going to right away, probably tomorrow, I'm going to follow up on that specific suggestion, because the way we've done it so far is we've done presentations to individual forestry companies or individual. We've done presentations to, for example, folks at COSIA, so the Canadian Oil Sands Innovation Alliance.
Yep.
So I think that there's always more opportunity out there that we haven't, necessarily followed up on yet, but I would like to. We submit, for example, on a quarterly basis, sort of what are we up to kind of blog to the Alberta Society of Professional Biologists, making sure we get into some agriculture producer newsletters and saying, this is some information, this is what we have to offer to you and your constituency. Same to the Rural Municipalities of Alberta newsletter. So, but I'm sure, like you just mentioned, the Forest Association group that I think, as far as I recall, we haven't yet reached out to. So that's a great one, and I would love to do that. Yeah,
I think there's a huge amount of power with this, and it's just around getting people to know about it. Right. I knew about ABMI. I had never visited your website until last year, right? Yeah. And looked you up, and we talked to each other a little bit, but. And then after that, I started looking through, and I'm like, "This is awesome! This is really, really cool." The fact that it's all working online and you can do that, right? These are huge tools that are definitely beneficial. And like you said, it has to be open to people's manipulation. What I want it for is not what an agricultural producer is going to want it for. Absolutely. Right? So it's totally different. So that's cool. I think we understand that there are different personas, and personas is not the right. It's sort of like a industry language, but it's sort of we know that there are people who have. If you're from forestry, you have specific things that you care about. If you're in the oil and gas sector, you have other things that you're required to look at and you care about, right? So absolutely, you need to be able to almost have a touch point in each of these tools that sort of says, if you're looking for this, here's a workflow that we might recommend for you, those kinds of things. And we're looking to do that. So the more input that we get from the specific industry groups or industry players, the better. Yeah. And the reason why I even bring up this engagement piece, we just completed our 10-year science and program review in 2017. And really the key thing was is that we need to ramp that up again. Okay. So we'd invested time into developing new tools, but for various reasons, there was there have been changes in governments, there have been changes in the way environmental monitoring has been done in the province, more players and so on and so forth. So tool development, new protocols that were being developed. But really what I think had taken a bit of a back burner was that engagement piece, which was going out and talking to the people who use this data
and figuring out are our tools working, and then also making people aware of it. So we've really ramped up that piece, and that I think is going to be like a central piece of what the ABMI has to do and continues to do going forward.
For sure.
Because again, it's that same thing again, where you can build it. Doesn't matter if you have the data or the tools or the knowledge, the best in the world it could be. I'm not saying that's the case here, although I feel very strongly about the credibility of the work that we do.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that, you can have all of that, and it still is long if it's not getting into the hands of the right people, and the people who need it, then I really feel like we should just stop doing it.
Yeah, well, that's just it, right? Like story Field of Dreams, but yeah, if they build it, they will come. It's like, no, not necessarily. It's like, yeah, they need to know about it, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, no, that's a really cool part. I'm really excited actually to find out that this is like an organization that's doing this type of stuff, right? Because I think this has been sorely missing in environmental management, right? And just having that capacity to discuss, like using biodiversity as a tool to discuss impact as a value that everyone can measure and we can relate to and say, okay, I'm having this much impact and this much impact, and having that common ground, that baseline to go back to. I think that's a really cool way to do it. And up until now, you couldn't really do it. So that's awesome. Well,
yeah,
I mean, up until now, but up until 1999, you couldn't really do it.
No, for sure. I totally hear you. And the thing is, what we saw that we've seen also, even just by increasing engagement to the degree that we have in the last year. So we've introduced new webinars, and we had another one of our external fora, but we also have somebody now who's a dedicated stakeholder engagement coordinator. Although I'm trying to drop the word stakeholder, I don't really like it. So our engagement coordinator, let's call her. She's been doing a lot of outreach to like the WPACs and other interested parties. And so we are actually seeing people come to us now much more deliberately. So maybe they were doing it passively before, but now we're also seeing them deliberately come and say, okay, can I use this in this way?
Yeah.
Or can you give me this, his human footprint information? And then we're really creating those relationships and then saying, okay, here are other things that you might not be aware of, and building on that. For example, we have a new thing called Alpha, which is the Advanced Land Cover Prediction and Habitat Assessment platform, which is really a range of different land cover layers based on Earth observation, real-time Earth observation data that are really brand new, sort of out-of-the-box tools that people are very excited about. So really giving us new updated wetland inventory for the province, helping us look at hydrotemporal variability, so the degree to which water bodies are ephemeral or are changing their size,
of course,
their thumbprint, if you will, or their water print.
Imagine this summer we had some real differences.
Totally. Actually, I would love to see that data. You're totally right. I think this summer have been very interesting in different parts of the province too, very wildly different. So we have a whole bunch of these tools that we're just excited to share with everyone. We're like, we know this will be helpful to you.
Totally. Or
we think this could be useful. There are ways in which we can improve it.
Yep.
Or even getting subject matter expert to help us do some peer review and making sure that we've got, because some of this stuff is very, new data, new satellite data, interpretations are new, using machine learning and cloud computing to develop some of these layers. So getting that subject matter review is also really, really important.
Big time.
And so just this past year and a half of doing that much more engagement, we have, we really have a lot more collaborations coming out, developing, and a lot more we're seeing. We have examples of, okay, here is a way in which our data is being used.
Yeah.
And we can actually point to that and say, look at this exciting stuff that's happening.
No, it is cool.
Indigenous groups too, Indigenous communities have been reaching out more, looking for opportunities for training on different things like remote cameras, acoustic recording units, which is the way in which we record vocalizing species.
Okay. You're just involved in everything. Hey, just dabble in everything.
Yeah, it's kind of
got
fun.
One foot on every base.
It's been super cool actually, because especially on the technology front, because there's all this, there's new technology available for providing web services.
Yeah.
That I feel like the ABMI is really now getting deep into the big data world.
Oh yeah.
And I know that's one of those sort of trendy terms, but truly, we have collected, as far as I heard last, like 0.5 petabyte of acoustic data over the last 5 years, which is 72 years of continuous listening. So obviously no human being can do that. So we have had to develop and this is in collaboration with the with Aaron Bain's lab, the bioacoustic unit at the University of Alberta. we've had to develop basically a data management, processing, and reporting platform. We're calling it Wild Tracks. It's going to be coming out at the end of September or the beginning of October. And that platform basically allows any third party, including the ABMI. So this is, again, about developing custom tools that help not just us, but data users to be able to manage and process their sensor data. So whether it be remote cameras that people are deploying or ARUs that people are deploying, and likely other sensors going forward. We've built the system to be modular, to be able to manage and process these large data sets. And to be able to process them, you have to use things like auto-recognizers. And auto-recognizers are now, these days, they're being built off machine learning, artificial intelligence approaches. So we have
taking our jobs, though.
Yeah. I was going to say, nobody can, unless somebody really wants to spend their entire career plus listening to these audio files, they might be very happy that we have such tools.
Yeah, no kidding.
But yeah, no, it's been really interesting to sort of see to learn, even on that note, to learn that machine learning and all this kind of stuff, it's cool, and it's going to definitely make some tools easier, but it's going to take a long time before we, have anything that would even resemble basic human intelligence. So that's pretty cool. It's good to know, because I read like what I see in the paper and hear on podcasts, even for that matter, and I go, oh my gosh. But then, you sort of you have that moment where you sober up and you kind of go, okay, these are cool tools, but really, the brain can do all this stuff in, microseconds that are still taking us years to sort of develop some of these tools that can do it in a faster fashion, of course.
Definitely.
But they still don't have that insight, if you will.
Not as accurate, maybe slightly, but it's if you've got to crunch that much data, you got to use something, right? Like
right.
You got to try and do it for an economically feasible way, for sure.
So anyways,
feasible way. I don't know what I'm saying right now.
No,
economically feasible way. There we go.
Feasible.
Words.
That's like how I mixed up website and well site. I don't think I've ever done that before.
We're getting there.
Yeah. So anyways, I say that the future of ABMI tools in the next 2 to 3 years are really about customization and integrating tools.
That's awesome.
So integrating this Wild Tracks tool with our mapping portal, so you can look at your data that you collect with your own cameras and your own ARUs or whatever sensor you have to be able to like push that data into a mapping environment and add any other layer you might want to, and be able to do the kind of custom queries. That's where we're also going into custom query land. To be able to sort the types of questions people have with this data.
For sure. You're gonna start tapping into people's cell phones and turning on their microphones. You can listen, like, what's going on downtown?
Absolutely not. I'm not even gonna joke about that. Although we do have a citizen science application, NatureLinks, so people can sign up for that, and then we will have, I guess, some idea of the type of biodiversity that they themselves collect photos of in Alberta. So that's the way in which we I guess monitor people.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Ha.
So do you this is all really exciting. Like, I think about like the way environmental management is going, and it just seems to be getting more and more specific, but also more and more broad in this sense, right? Where we're starting to include everything into the same measurement scheme to try and bring everything together and not just have all these random offshoots of, protections and that kind of stuff. So do you see much for, like, I'm not sure if this is something that you come across often or not, but being a science communicator, maybe, like a reluctance to these types of changes? Because, like, for me, I'm really excited about it, because it's going to put extra restrictions on what we do in the landscape, but ultimately that's a good thing, right? And do you see much resistance to having more information? You know what I mean? Because it is going to reduce economic capacity and that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a really good question. I think there's a lot of different components to your question that I'll try to unpack a little bit here. So I do think that technology is not the thing that's going to, save the world. I think it's a tool, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So, and there's also unintended consequences of tools that you might develop, and you might not have considered a particular scenario that needed to be considered, that then somehow, your tool creates problems for. And I'll just give you an example, which is, a lot of people are excited about our biodiversity app, NatureLinks, but there's been a lot of around these types of apps that exist worldwide. The question is, well, are we drawing attention to where hunted species are, or to species at risk. And therefore, could we be potentially actually, increasing pressure on those species?
Gotcha.
And so there's that whole idea of, well, how do we make sure that we give valid information and data on the distribution of species, while at the same time ensuring that there's still protection for those that may be more vulnerable for different reasons.
Totally.
So, so these are just things that you need to think about with any tool. Like, what are some possible risks that could be associated with it?
Yep.
And so in the case of NatureLinks, we, and this is a commonly used practice worldwide, again, is you haze those locations, at least in the public news feed. And if people are interested in doing research, we do make that data available to them. If they have a particular question of interest, you can download the data still on the website. It's got the haze locations. But if you want to actually have the unhazed locations, you just have to submit saying, this is who I am, this is the kind of research that I'm going to do, just so we know who has the data and why they want to use it.
So what do you mean by hazed? I'm not sure.
So we, in fact, we've used different approaches. Basically, we just do like a random offset of where the site actually is.
Oh, I see.
And so that it's not, so where you see it on a map isn't exactly where that observation was taken.
Gotcha.
So that's what all I mean by haze. It's sort of blinded in some way.
That makes sense. Yeah. Totally. Okay.
And so if you want to get the exact GPS coordinates, then you just need to request those from us, from that application.
Gotcha. Cool.
And so, so I'm saying all technology has that. I think that there are risks associated with it. And, sometimes you don't know what those risks are, and you have to just be aware of them as they emerge and try to manage them as best as possible. The other thing I do hear from people, and I think this is a fully legitimate, there's a sense of overwhelm, I think,
totally,
that people
for
have.
Sure.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Like there is big data is exactly what it is. It's a lot of data, and you're like, okay, great. We're not really in a data drought, if you will, or we're not in a data desert, but oddly, it's almost, I think it's, in some cases, it's paralyzing. Like, what do I do with it? I can't process it. It takes me forever to process it. And then even then, sometimes, even if you have a lot of data, if it's, not good data, if it's garbage in, it's still garbage out. Yeah. Or if you're missing the actual data, that's the critical piece that you need for your question, you still aren't really in a position where you can do what you want to do. So it's always about, like, are we collecting the right data in the right way? Are we analyzing, are we making sure that we are, that we've considered all the variables that are important for a particular question? And then once you make this data available to people, how do you make it so that it's actually penetrable, where it's, it's manageable, where you can sort of say, you can filter it this way, you can eliminate it this way, you can augment it this way. And these are the different ways you can do all of those things. So I definitely think that, yes, I'm very excited about that the ABMI is in this era of big data, and we're trying to figure out how to do that. But what I'm hearing more and more from people is it's not so much about that there are data gaps now, but I think that there's more service gaps. Like there is a need for people who are data scientists, data analysts, data managers, to be able to make meaning of any of this. For sure. I think that's a huge thing.
Got to make it user friendly, right?
Yeah. And the other thing is, for example, in the biodiversity, part of the biodiversity app for us is so that people can sort of go, oh, look, there's this cool thing here in Elk Island. I'm curious. I want to go find this wildflower or this bee or whatever it might be, right? Giving people a tool to re-engage or engage for the first time or continue to engage with nature. But then there's still a sense, and then I'm speaking personally here, is sometimes we still end up having this mediated experience, right? So how do we create authentic relationships with nature, with the natural environment in the absence, with these tools, if they're valuable, or to make sure that when they're not needed, that, we're willing to sort of put them aside. So I think as a biodiversity organization, I find it interesting sometimes how little I'm actually, in the field myself. Yeah, for sure. Having said that, there are lots of people who work at the ABMI who definitely, get out there and they're field, they're the research taxonomists, they're the research biologists, or the ecologists, they're the field technicians. Yep. Don't get me wrong, but I'm just saying that you could probably work for a biodiversity monitoring organization, even as a scientist, and never really get outside because you're just dealing with data and analysis of that data and interpretation of that data. Yep. So, the other thing I was going to say is, the question that I've always personally had is, can we use this data in such a way, again, this would be in the hands of decision makers, and the ABMI is not We do not make these. We do not.
You're information providers.
Yeah, we're information providers. We do not advocate for any particular outcomes. But I was just going to say, I feel like there needs to be a way in which we can have a living, working landscape and still protect environmental values.
Absolutely.
So I don't consider them to be diametrically opposed. I think that with information, we can make decisions and such that we can, I think, ideally have less impact on certain landscapes that are probably already under a lot of pressure, where we can identify those species that could potentially be vulnerable or already vulnerable and find ways to mitigate. And so that's really my personal viewpoint on that. And certainly, our goal isn't, again, to sort of say, we need to pull back on, we can't have working landscapes in Alberta. Otherwise, it's going to go to hell in a handbasket. I think we recognize that, that we can manage working landscapes in a way that hopefully maintain environmental values.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. Absolutely. I think, I mean, we've had a lot of run and gunning in the last 100 or whatever, 10 decades. We had a lot of just kind of taking what we need and going, right? And in the recent last 50 years, we've gotten increasingly better at doing things wiser and having less impact. But I think, that trajectory never ends, right? We're constantly have to continue to get better. Otherwise, we're like, what are we really doing here, right? So it can't be a situation where you just take what you need and don't worry about the rest. So I totally agree that there is definitely a way to do this in a sustainable fashion, if only we have the information, which is what this is all about, right?
Well, and also I think this is where there's a broader societal question. We also need to, have it be a priority for society, and then if it's a priority, then ideally there would be people who make decisions accordingly, right?
Absolutely.
So yeah, I mean, on a personal note, I think this is me personally talking is, just my experience, even just trying to communicate biodiversity to people, it's a tough concept. Like, I realized we didn't even make the definition here. The definition of biodiversity is the diversity of life, right? But it's at different scales. It could be at the landscape level, like there's different habitats, different types of ecosystems. Then it's at the species level. There's all these different kinds of species, and then there's even at the genetic level that there's even differences amongst populations of a given species that you can see at the genetic level, right?
Yep.
But even just talking about biodiversity is a difficult concept. So, like, even explaining that, what does diversity of life mean, and how does it actually, what does it do for us? What have you done for me lately, biodiversity?
Yeah,
it's hard to communicate, right? And so I just sort of think, I wonder to myself sometimes personally, is it something so fundamentally different that we need to do to help create those connections between people and the natural environment that we live in? Because I agree, we need data to make good decisions, and we need tools to help us make those decisions, and that's my job here at the ABMI. And then I also wonder, just separately as a human being, like, there's also something about we live in an urban environment, and we're often mediated through technology that I think we're getting further and further away from having a personal connection to these things. And so I definitely think that part of our job also, I think, is to tell the stories of the biodiversity that are here in the province, just to give people different ways of relating to it and thinking about it and personalizing it. So totally. I get excited about that piece too.
Oh yeah, no, me too, for sure. Like, that connection part of it is, like, in a world where the technology is so crazy, and you can be in virtual reality literally and like live there if you want. And there's a lot of, it's really easy to never go outside, or to be the only time you go outside is the walk from like the office to the car, and then that's it, right? And then like your annual hiking trip you do, like, for 2 days out of the 365 in a year or whatever, and you're like, I'm in touch with nature. It's just like it's awesome, but it's also like, we should be doing more. But I think that's the interesting part, is trying to relate that to the public, not just managers and that kind of stuff. And why is this important in order for it to be continued to be supported and paid for and all this kind of stuff. So I totally agree. No, I love that.
Fairly recently, like, I'm trying to remember what year it was, like 2015 or 2016, we actually changed our vision and mission to really include that engaging the Albertans more broadly, not just land use decision makers, but also sharing our knowledge and understanding of Alberta species in a much more, sort of intimate way, rather not just digitally, not through just papers and things like that.
Yeah.
And so that's partly why we developed the citizen science application, and then now go, like participate in family nature nights here at the city of Edmonton, so people can, it's sort of like using the tool as a way to sort of let's really be together in natural spaces and appreciate them. Also just to appreciate the diversity that actually is Alberta. Like when I first started thinking about Alberta biodiversity way back before when I started this job, I really thought, okay, deer, caribou, moose, like maybe some iconic pronghorn,
charismatic megafauna.
Exactly. That's all I had about, right? Like, and so when people are like, okay,
it's the big stuff with horns or teeth.
Exactly. So I definitely fell into that camp, and then I was like, how do we have like data on like 3,000 species? Like, what are the other 2,900 species?
Yeah.
And that's itself just a scratch of the surface, right? Scratch on the. What I'm trying to say.
I know what you're trying to say.
Yes, it's just like the tip of the iceberg. And so, some people say there's probably like 80,000 some species in Alberta. So just having some of our taxonomists be able to say, hey, look, this lichen species, for example, it actually has these different symbionts as part of this, as part of the lichen. And this is where, this is how they might be good monitors of air pollution, or this is where you find them in these environments, and this is their life cycle. And look at these different, these different anatomical features, or these different, just the architecture of the organism itself, or the colors and the compounds they produce. Basically, starting to understand more intimately the details of some of these species, and you go, wow, there really is like an Amazon there is like we have a very diverse backyard. For sure. Very biodiverse backyard here in Alberta. And there is a lot to discover here, and we don't need to go to exotic tropical places to sort of find some of that.
It's not as sexy as the Amazon, though, for some reason, right?
I don't know. I think it's because it's hotter there.
Yeah,
there's maybe more singing. You can hear
monkeys and stuff.
Yeah, it's true.
Well, even with like the Amazon being on fire right now, I hear there's lots of stuff going around online, like the Amazon makes 20% of the world's oxygen or whatever, and you're like, well, that's not true. You're like, that's not even remotely true. Like the boreal forest is the biggest forest on the planet, period, right. Like across Russia and Canada, and it creates, like, out of the forests, it creates the most amount of oxygen. But there's like, it's interesting though, no matter what's going on down there, people will defend the Amazon, but the boreal forest is not really a focus.
Yeah, right? It's true. I feel like I've learned a lot about the boreal, like the fact that it's the largest contiguous forest remaining on the planet, and that it is this huge carbon sink, for example. And obviously, it's also the lungs of the earth. It is one of the sets of lungs of the earth. One of the, right?
Besides the 50% of it that comes from phytoplankton or whatever, right? But yeah.
So the boreal, I've gotten a lot more respect for the boreal forest these days.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, not that the Amazon, of course we need to pay attention to the Amazon. It's under way more pressures, like deforestation wise and that kind of stuff, but obviously. But yeah, it's interesting to note that the forests in your backyard people are ignoring, because they're just like, you know what I mean? Just there's not a lot of, the boreal forest doesn't have a lot of good publicity, right? It doesn't have a lot of publicity, period. It seems like, in the public. So it's interesting to hear that from you, say that, like, there is this massive amount of biodiversity, especially when it comes down to, like you were saying, lichen species or whatever, right? Like, it gets crazy. I'm sure we haven't even figured them all out, right? We're just guessing, right? But it's so
we've, like, for example, the ABMI has actually discovered new to science. Oribatid species, oribatid mite species. So these are basically soil insects, and they play roles in probably nutrient cycling of different kinds, soil building of different kinds. But what's interesting, what we've discovered because there's not very much known about this group of organisms. We're starting to see that they're present in certain areas of the province. Some species are present, some are not at all, and some may be good indicators of above ground activity. So might be good indicators of reclamation. And so we've actually discovered, by looking at the species more closely, new species to science, and reported on them as such new species to science. So I was just saying that And I think this is probably the truth everywhere. Like we just don't understand the breadth of diversity globally.
Absolutely.
But there are still things to discover in Alberta, and whether it's new species that are seen for the first time in Alberta or seen for the first time in Canada or are new to science, the taxonomists who work for the ABMI, who are based out of the Royal Alberta Museum, and we have a great partnership with the Royal Alberta Museum. The taxonomic work that they do there also brings that depth of understanding to the species samples that we're collecting. So it's not just about going and sort of putting a name to a thing and sort of saying, okay, we found one of them here, but it's also then understanding, well, what could they be doing there and how are they contributing to, the ecosystem function, or are they good indicators of human activity on the landscape? Like, can we use them as indicators of different types of activity? So there's a lot of questions that are being posed by those specialists. Like we have a lichenologist, an acarologist, studies mites, aquatic invertebrate specialists, vascular plant specialist, bryologist, studies mosses, and so those folks are really doing that deep dive in terms of what are the species here, where are they found, what are they doing, what are they responsive to, and contributing that knowledge to the global community.
For
really.
sure. It's all the small things that we don't know about, right? But they could be equally, they probably are equally as important as whatever, right? Like I don't imagine we're going to run across another megafauna that we don't know about.
No, that I don't think will happen. But
unfortunately, I don't think we're going to find Sasquatch out there somewhere in the boreal running around. But I mean,
we have found some cool things. Like we found a cool thing from the fact that you can see it more easily by your eye. You don't need a microscope for it. But like we found we had a sighting of we identified an orchid species, a dragon orchid species in northern Alberta that hadn't been found before.
That's
and
awesome.
So there's a few vascular plants that have been now detected in Alberta that we didn't know about until very recently in the last few years. So there's still things like that even happening, just because we're getting into parts of the province that haven't been really well studied or have probably not been visited by Western scientists per se, anytime recently.
It's not that nobody knows, but like I imagine a lot of the indigenous communities know a lot about some of these like more rare plants that they probably have histories of it, but for the Western science maybe hasn't gotten there yet or whatever. And
so actually on that note, it's really great that there are now more efforts to sort of look at rare plants of cultural value to indigenous communities, particularly in the boreal forest. There are some projects that are taking place through, for example, Scott Nielsen's lab and being funded by the oil sands monitoring agreement envelope of dollars, looking at culturally significant plants to indigenous communities. And so I think that hopefully at some point there'll be a good intersection of some of the Western science approaches to monitoring these species, and then also really understanding that a lot of that knowledge has already been deep within some of these communities, right?
Totally. Yeah. There's a lot of knowledge there that Western culture hasn't tapped into at all, right? And that we can learn a lot from that. I don't think it's even possible to understand the breadth of that, right? Like it's cool. This is awesome though. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. This is cool to get the deep dive into kind of like how this is all going to work. And like I probably stop now because we're going to keep going forever. I feel like
I was just going to say, what am I missing? I was like, well, I would also say the other thing I was going to say is that the ABMI, what's not in our name, although monitoring is in our name, is all the other stuff that you have to do. If anyone's who does monitoring, also does like protocol development, data management, quality assurance. In our case, we do all of that data. We do all that specimen processing and taxonomic work. So what I always like to say about the ABMI is that we're sort of a full service organization.
Totally.
From, science to impact. That's really, we operate in all of those spaces. Obviously key to it is the monitoring work, but we can't do that without the underpinning of good scientific protocols and evaluations of those protocols. The folks that actually figure out how to operationalize that, the folks who come in and who take the data and make sure it's managed well, so in perpetuity people have access to it and can make interpretations of it, and then all of the scientific analysis that comes out that then are converted into tools that people can then use to make operational decisions.
Totally, because absolutely, because if this was just a monitoring institute, I think almost all of the information would be lost. Because it just wouldn't be collected and used by other people, right? Because they wouldn't know about it or whatever. So you need that
infrastructure or people who are dedicated to those pieces.
You need to take it from field up into something that is useful like in a policy perspective or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So no, I think it's this organization is sorely needed. It's really cool to see that this is going on, right? I think the next step, I've asked this of a couple people, is it'd be interesting to get to a point, again, from the forestry perspective, of like a decision matrix or decision key, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where we go, okay, these are all the factors we have to worry about when we're harvesting this, this blueberry pine stand or whatever, right? And the proximity to certain habitats and the rareness of certain plants and how much of a, like research we need to do into there to make sure that we're not stumbling upon, I don't know, something that's uncommon or whatever, right? And having that decision matrix to help us decide where to and not to put our footprint, right? Like that kind of stuff is, but there's so much there, from water to aquatic invertebrates to bears and air quality and whatever, like sediment and all kinds of stuff, right? And so but I think that's another type of thing that an organization like this would be able to put together, but it would take, this big of an organization with this much focus to get to that point. But it's I think we're working towards that, right? We're moving in that direction. So it's cool.
No, I agree with you. I mean, that's one of the things that, that feedback that we collected from those needs assessments, people were really saying is we need your data to be available in such a way that it supports those kinds of complex queries, and it's sort of like a decision support tool.
Exactly.
So we've built a database now that we've put in our data in that allows for rapid queries. So we've tested it, for example, to say, if we were to do a query like, please show me if there's any area in Alberta that satisfies the following conditions. It's good quality caribou habitat. It's good rusty blackbird habitat, and it's 500 meters away from human footprint.
Okay.
So now we can actually, having the right input data into that database, we were able to run that query in less than, I think it was 4 seconds.
Oh, nice.
And so we're now going to start developing this year the user interface that allows people then to say, what kind of query do I want to establish? Like sort of be able to set the constraints and choose the data sets they want to be able to ask those kinds of queries. So that's coming.
Nice.
And so that's, I think, one step towards the kind of thing you're talking about. But really, people have pushed us to say, we want a decision support tool, one that, we feel is credible because you're making peer-reviewed data layers available, and that we're not setting up queries that are somehow biologically irrelevant or can be misused somehow. That's the tricky part. And then really relying on our scientists to help guide that process.
That's awesome.
So yeah, we're really moving in that direction because that's, like I said, that's what people have said that they really want. They want to be able to understand. They want to be able to see what can the data tell them, not just in one data point at a time, but when you look at all the data cumulatively or, at once, are there certain things that they need to be paying attention to that help them make certain kinds of decisions?
For sure.
Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. I love it.
Yeah.
I'm so excited. I'm going to be paying close attention to you
cool.
guys from now on.
Well, as soon as it comes out, I will email you and I'll be like,
definitely.
Or I'll send you a piece of snail mail. How's that?
Yeah.
I'll go old school.
Keeping people employed.
Yeah.
Despite the technology, damn
yes,
it.
Exactly.
Awesome.
But no, we're very excited about that. And so I would expect that you would see stuff like that coming out in the next, I'd say, 12 months or so.
Awesome.
Yeah.
This has been great. If there's any kind of final thoughts you wanted to throw in as a closer.
My only closer was that I just think that, one thing that the people who originally, the foresters and the academics who came together and said we need like a monitoring organization, forget about ABMI, per se. I'm just saying that I think Alberta does have a robust environmental monitoring system, not just ours. There are other folks doing great work in air and water and things like that too. And it's just something that we underreport. That is not well known outside of Alberta. It's not well known inside of Alberta. And I think this is a really these efforts are a made in Alberta success story. Like globally, we should be saying, hey, we are leaders in environmental monitoring. This, we can demonstrate that. We ourselves, we present at, international conferences. We're in President Scientific conferences, and there are other monitoring organizations that do the same. It's just not well known that we have this infrastructure. And that there were people who pushed for this 15, 20 years ago, who had the foresight to say, we're in a province where, there is a large working landscape here. And that will continue to be that way. We need to collect the kind of data information that helps us make better decisions.
Yeah.
And we continue to support that as a province. And I think, I think it's like I said, I think I applaud the people who had that foresight. And I also feel like, Albertans in general should be proud of that effort.
Mm-hmm.
ABMI or not, there's a lot of this effort going on
Totally.
in the province. And I think it's doing a good service for the province. And we're a leader that way in Canada. There's just no doubt about it.
Oh, for sure. No, it's super, super cool. I mean, I had a conversation I had the other day with Peter Murphy talking about, and he mentioned, I'm going to screw it up, but I think it was in the early 1900s. There was an early attempt at protecting watershed, so recognizing the importance of protecting the eastern slopes as water quality downstream or whatever, right? And it was like, you look at 100 years ago, and they're thinking that, you know what I mean, in that fashion. So like this has always been around. I just think now we're to the point where there's so much information available that it's hard to ignore, and we could really start to dive into the specifics behind it, right? And I think the main reason it's not being used, just because, like you said, it is overwhelming, right? Like, how do I can go through on the website and pick out, like, okay, where we're going to find wild rose, where am I going to find blueberry, where am I going to find whatever, right? Like sweet vetch or whatever it's going to be, and you can pop it up and it'll tell me the likelihood of it being there. But that's, people go, okay, well, that's cool, but what do I do with this? But it's getting the right people to find out about it, and it'll get used, and it'll push policy, and we're sort of keep moving in that sustainable direction. I love it. It's awesome.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, well, you and we can talk offline too about, I'd love to pick your brain about how we can make the information more useful for your work. But I was just going to say, consultants and industry, there's a large environmental industry in Alberta for obvious reasons. And I feel like we want to work more closely with consultants and make sure that it's clear that the data is useful and available to them, because in the end analysis, those are often the people that are on the ground making these kinds of collecting, verifying data, or collecting the information that's available to help in supporting these decisions. So I really want to, from my personal perspective, is it would be really great to establish much more strong connections with consultancies in Alberta.
For sure.
Forest, oil and gas, whatever, agriculture, all of those. Yeah.
Well, I think there's a lot of parallel thinking, a lot of parallel projects that we don't really recognize are going on, right? Some of them fail and some of them don't, but I think there's a lot of parallel thinking when it comes to that kind of stuff. So for sure, I think it's cool just to see what other people are doing and to not close the door because they're a competitor or they're whatever, right?
Yeah,
like, let's all just like work together. We all have a similar, you know what I mean? Similar values. You want to get the similar thing done. Like, let's do it, right? So
yeah, and there's also this idea that even if there are like multiple, data generators, that if you aggregate that data, then you're already in a much better position. You're in a better position to make decisions. So it's really about how do we break down the data silos that up until now have existed for whatever reason. Like there were infrastructure reasons or time reasons or whatever it might be,
money
technology
reasons,
money reasons, all those reasons.
A lot of it would be money, I would guess.
But I'm just saying there is a lot of additional data out there that we're still not tapping into, and I think that there's opportunities to aggregate that data and even have maybe even more powerful decisions, or have the tools to make better decisions.
We have to be willing to share that data and get it out there, because otherwise we don't know where we might be missing because we were too egotistical to share something or too afraid of losing our job or whatever it is, right? Like the more data sharing, the better, right? Like, absolutely. Yeah, no, it's awesome. I love it. This is so cool.
Well, thank you for coming today.
Thank you for having me on, even though you're under the weather. So this is great.
Yeah.
You don't sound it though. You nailed it. Thanks a lot for listening, guys. I really enjoyed that. I hope you did too. Thanks a lot, Tara, for coming on. That was a great conversation. I couldn't have asked for a better, discussion around biodiversity and how we can start to apply those metrics onto the landscape for, better decision making. So that was great. Awesome. Thanks a lot. I hope you guys liked it. And make sure to rate and review and all that good stuff. It really helps me out. Tell a friend, and we'll catch you guys next time. Take it easy.